Over here, very briefly, you see, well, both their mode of operation and, quite importantly, their weaponry. The mainstay of the weaponry would consist, right over here, of a thrusting spear, about 7 feet long. It has, at the very top, a round bronze counterweight. It actually looks like an apple. That's the reason why sometimes they're referred to as the quote-unquote apple bearers. Sometimes they might employ a lighter and smaller throwing spear, the palta, and for last-ditch defense only, they might also have a dagger, the so-called akinaka, with only a 10 to 14-inch blade. The usual way in which they operated is best described right over here, using the shield as protection and essentially providing a continuous screen for the auxiliaries, in this case either slingers or missile troops, to be able to operate. But at least as far as any of the enemies that the Persians have encountered thus far, right, bar the Greeks, they have been also particularly effective as an offensive group. These are the takabara, and this indeed is the mainstay of the Persian infantry. You guys can see right over here from this depiction the kind of weaponry that they usually would employ. The palta, the throwing javelin, the akinakes, which is a short thrashing sword that can also be used indeed for thrusting sword, but also used for slashing. Sometimes you might see them with the kopis, which is again a slashing sword that has a curved blade. For anyone who's seen the representations of Alexander's battles, or of Alexander in battle with the sword, curved one, that indeed is the kopis. A dagger, the akinaka, and last but not least, another characteristic weapon, the sagaris. This is, of course, an actual hatchet or a battle axe. You guys can see that it consists of a rather long, in this case, cane or a base made out of wood. You can see the way in which you have a double, essentially, spike, the axe head itself, and of course with the spike in the back, and last but not least, also containing, as you can see, a bronze counterweight. This is extremely effective in practically every respect, and that's the reason why many Persian armies tend to use it. When it comes to defensive equipment, we can actually be talking lack of. Quilted linen seems to be all the rage in Persian army at the time. The tapka, in fact, their term or their naming comes from the very characteristic crescent-type shield, the one indeed that you tend to see right over here. Occasionally they might cradle the ghetto, which is like the Argive figure 8 shield. Those of you, of course, in the class of Nicola will probably have encountered that, which is made out of reed, again, or wicker. And once again, there's absolutely no other protection in the form of a helmet, greaves, or any sort of guards. Now, these are the bad boys, Persian archers. One of the 2 most formidable, along with cavalry, units that you would find within the Persian army. They tend to have, and this seems to be almost universal, the so-called, this would have been a K, so therefore the Scythian style, recurved composite bow, which had a length of around about 3 to 4 feet. We refer to it as a recurve because, as you can see, the tips of these bow go against the natural inclination of the bow itself. There's a good reason for this. It in fact has tremendous or much better drawing power. Already modern estimates talk about a drawing power of 88 pounds, which I can assure you is rather impressive. It can in fact generate much more kinetic energy after the release of the arrow itself. And, at least as far as medium range shots are concerned, it can also be deadly accurate. As you can see, he also has a high capacity quiver and a bow case, which is swung around their left hip for rapid fire rate. I know this might seem a little bit hindering. I know it might seem a little bit out of place to see that this is the place where they would have the quiver and bows, but it makes perfect sense because, in fact, without deterring them or without hindering their movement to fire an arrow, it actually makes sense because the Persians, whenever they drew arrows, they only used these 2 fingers. So the middle finger and the index finger. Quick, draw, release. Simple. It actually is much better way of throwing an art, or throwing in fact an arrow, than what the Greeks or the Romans used, because the Greeks and Romans used their index finger and their thumb. Now, as a result, as I said, less drawing power and less effective range and less accuracy, of course, than any Persian troop at the time. The arrows, as you guys can see, are made out of cane, tipped with a double or sometimes triple fine bronze arrowhead, 1 to 2 feet, varying weight. Anywhere between 38 grams and 55 is what archaeological evidence tells us. These are light arrows. which means that, and again this is important for the future reckoning of Marathon, minimum capacity, penetrative capacity against a Greek or Athenian hoplite armor or indeed shield. The range. You guys, if you just Google maximum range of Persian arrows, you will see ranges varying from 1,200 yards down to 50. Just that simple. We have done modern reconstructions, and despite the fact that they themselves have certain limitations, it seems, and this in fact I have personal experience with, that the maximum range that these guys can achieve does not exceed the 250 yards. It's actually less than 150 if you consider the actual kill zone, where the arrow is indeed effective. Last but not least, this is an important part, these are not direct archers. They don't fire directly at an angle of around about 7 degrees towards the enemy. They like their arrows to be basically at a higher velocity. They use the sloped technique as it's known, and they rely on medium range missile barrage, high trajectory, and quick fire rate. These guys are not there to basically kill the enemy, they're there to intimidate the enemy, they're there to break enemy's cohesion. That's what they're most effective at. Persian cavalry. Don't think of anything heavy, don't think of the West Iranian cavalry, don't think of the chainmails, the cataphracts, all the nice things the Persian cavalry have brought to us, because the Persian cavalry in Marathon is essentially what you see over there. Herodotus, in fact, very indicative of this, armed in the same way as their own footmen, which would suggest, of course, pretty much the same armament, the crescent-type shield, and not more than one, or perhaps, most likely, 2 javelins, one throwing, one thrusting, in order to be used. Once again, you guys can notice their complete lack of any armor, personal for the rider, let alone for the horse itself. That is another interesting rendition of how the Persian archers, or the Persian cavalry participating in Marathon would indeed look like. Okay, so 490 in May, we have the launching of the expedition, starting off, of course, from the area of Mikale. It seems, although this, or the veracity, or if you like, the accuracy of this seems to be a little bit debatable, but the Persian fleet decided initially, instead of just crossing over to the area of Euboea, of Eretria, and of course of Attica, of first visiting Rhodes. It's an awesome island, it's definitely recommended that you guys should go, where indeed they seem to have conducted another punitive exhibition, successful one, against the Rhodians. Poor Naxos. Naxos and Persians have a very difficult history. In 499, in fact, the Naxians managed to repel a Persian advance. This time they didn't get that lucky. Apparently the outcome of that was again successful, all the way stretching up to the area of Euboea and Eretria. The Eretrians, to be entirely honest, didn't really stand much of a chance, especially when they took the decision to defend behind their walls instead of meeting the enemy outside. Herodotus would have you believe that the Eretrians or Eretria fell after treason. Some of the people inside just opened the gates over to Persia, a little too convenient. Either ways, especially when firing behind walls, it would have been nothing more than target practice for the Persian archers. After that, from Eretria, we're basically talking about a very small, a very brief trek all the way down to Marathon. And there it is. This is the Bay of Marathon, indeed as it tends to look today. You can imagine that some things have changed due to landfill or alluvial deposits. You guys can already see that this represents an actual optimal place to land. It's only 26 miles away from Athens. More importantly, as you can see by the actual map itself, it provides you the actual beach for the disembarkation of your troops, the actual docking of your ships. As you can see, you have protection all the way in front of your ships through the area of the Great Marsh. At the same time, it has excellent source of water, which of course would have been very important for people who need daily intake of water. And last but not least, should the need arise, it also, the flat valley in between the hills overlooking Marathon, also represent optimal ground for cavalry operations. It didn't get any better. Turning to the Athenians then. Because the minute that, in this case, the Athenians heard of the Persian landing over to Marathon, once again, it seems that deliberation and much discussion took place as to what to do. There are usually those, or were usually those, who believe that once again, let's try and defend the city itself instead of marching out.